My name is Michael Taft, and I'm the head of the archive at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. Well, the American Folklife Center has been around since 1976, but its archive has been around since 1928. It precedes the establishment of the center itself, and it is the largest ethnographic archive in the country and the most extensive. And is in fact an international archive in the sense that we not only collect traditional material from the United States but from around the world. And we started out from the 1920s on up basically as an archive of American folk song. It was called the Archive of American Folk Song. But and we've collected incredible material through that mandate of collecting all American folk song, which is the first mandate of the archives. Everything from early Native American material from the 1890s, which we received from other agencies before we were even established, through the most iconic kinds of traditional music collected by the Lomaxes, John and Alan Lomax, among others, great African American collections. And certainly in the present day, we have huge collections of material on specific topics, whether it's storytelling from the International Storytelling Foundation or the StoryCorps project in which people interview each other. We have all of those recordings. Or a few years ago, the Local Legacies project, where every congressional district gave us traditional material, so that we have grown from an archive of folk song to really an archive of folk culture, of folk life, all aspects, from song to music to dance to narrative, belief, ritual, and material culture. So there's no aspect of folk life that we do not cover. Now, that includes oral history, and we were never an oral history archive as such, but even our earliest recordings where, let's say, the Lomaxes would record a singer. Invariably, they would ask that singer, where did you get that song? Where are you from? And the singer would give a life history or give maybe a history of the song. Let's say it's a wreck song, a train wreck song. Well, that's from such and such a train wreck, and tell something about that train wreck. That's oral history. So that even though the early collectors would not have called what they were doing oral history, they were in fact collecting oral history. We have that kind of material in our archive. However, by around the 1940s, the archive began to see itself more in the business of collecting oral history. And I'm thinking specifically of the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, December 7th. Directly the next day, Alan Lomax, who was the director of the archive back then, sent telegrams out to field workers around the country who were using our equipment and said, stop your regular projects and collect first reactions to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And which they did, and that's all been digitized and is up online as a site now, or maybe around 10 or 12 hours of people around the country, ordinary, man in the street kind of interviews, just talking about their first reactions. So that was our first probably concerted, conscious effort to collect oral history. But ever since that time, we've collected more and more. It's become part of our mandate, part of the of collecting American traditions, because talking about history, talking about events, personal interpretations of what's going on is also a part of tradition and a part of culture, and we feel is really part of our mandate. Well, before the digital age, if you wanted to listen or look at any of our collection, you pretty much had to come to our reading room. You had to come to Washington. That's still true with a lot of our collections, but over the last 10 years or so, we have tried to digitize as much as possible, and there are two reasons for doing this. Everything we have, whether it's a recording or a piece of paper or photograph, has a shelf life. It's going to degrade, and a lot of our collection has degraded. Either the sound is not as good as it was when the sound was first put on a disc or a tape, or the photograph has faded somewhat, despite our best efforts. So if we're going to win the battle of maintaining and preserving this great collection of material that we have, we cannot rely on the original formats that they were recorded on. We can't even rely on the state-of-the-art archival formats from the pre-digital age that we have preservation copies of. We have the best audio tape that money could buy back in the day for preservation copies. Those tapes are deteriorating at sometimes a faster rate than the original formats, the old discs, the cylinders, the wire recordings which we have. So we know we can't rely on the analog world to preserve this material, nor can we rely on the analog world to present this material to a wide audience beyond those who come into our reading room or those who have the money or inclination to buy a recording or a book. We want to really make our collection more accessible than that. And the only way of doing that is through digitization, through establishing standards, which is really our first major challenge, I suppose. Back 10 years ago, it was not, there was no standard. There was no automatic assumption for how you digitize a sound recording, for instance. What's the sampling rate that you would use? Do you record stereo or mono? All these kinds of questions were very much open around 10 years ago. So when I first got here a decade ago or so, those questions were very much in the forefront before we began digitizing anything. What will our standards be? What kind of equipment will we use? Do we have the equipment? Do we have the software? How will software change over time, as it has in turning analog to digital? These are fundamental questions before you try to preserve anything. We think we've solved most of those problems, recognizing that we're still very much in what I like to call the wind-up gramophone era of the digital age. We're at the very beginning, and undoubtedly 50 years from now, archivists will look back and laugh at what we've done to some extent, or I hope treat us charitably in this respect. But we think we've captured sound well enough that the human ear will not pick up any difference between the digital recording and its original analog recording that it came from. And we hope we're doing the same thing with our photographs, with text, and with moving image. And each of them have their own problems, everything from how do you capture an analog item to how do you store it, to how do you present it. So the challenges don't end. It used to be that we were very worried about how much room we were taking up on servers. That was a big problem. In the same way as we always worry about how much shelf space do we have in the library proper for books, server space was at a premium. That does not seem to be the case as much anymore. I wouldn't say the problem is solved, but we seem to be running behind the technology that gives us more and more server space, which is where we want to be. 5 or 6 years ago, we were running ahead of it. We could not store video very well on our servers. The files were too big. We were forced to use digibeta tape, other off-the-shelf items, which we really did not want to do because any shelf item deteriorates, whereas a digital item on a server can be updated, not to mention the fact that a tape on a shelf is difficult to serve compared to a file on a server. We seem to have solved that problem for now, but files keep getting bigger, so I think we'll be in a constant mode, like a relay race, if you like, between the size of the files and the capacity of the servers to hold those files. And it'll probably be a problem again in the future. So it's going to keep coming back to us in that respect. Well, here we have the luxury at the Library of Congress of being a large institution with a good budget, excellent staff, and top equipment for digital preservation and presentation. we can't expect that every institution has that same capacity. So that although at the library here we tried to establish standards, we realized that our best practices, as we tried to establish them, may not be feasible at a regional or local level. And it's a matter of the compromises you make. I think now the ability to capture recordings at a high level is something which almost any institution can do. And of course now, in the present day, virtually every institution is capturing things digitally, capturing interviews digitally. And it's as easy to capture at a high rate, 96/24, as it would be at a low rate. So certainly we would counsel capturing material at a high rate. But again, storing that might be a problem for a small or even regional institution. The thing to think about in this age, in the past we thought that once an archive has an item, it's the lone repository. It has the only responsibility for that item, whether it's a tape or a book or whatever. In the digital age, that's not really the case. You can take your digital item and replicate it as often as you want and send it to a larger institution. Share it with other institutions. It's the old lots of copies keep stuff safe idea, the locks idea. It's certainly true for oral history and ethnographic collections. If you're a small institution, think about an allegiance with a larger institution that has more secure servers that can take copies of your digital material and store them as a backup. Now, it may well be, and it should be, that the local or regional institution will be the first point of contact for any researchers and should have the main responsibility for presenting the material through websites or publications. But it's, I think, advisable for any institution to look to another larger institution if they don't have the capabilities for permanent preservation of these digital items. It's not good enough, I think, for any institution to think they've stored their material on CDs or DVDs and think that's the end of the problem. That's the beginning of the problem. They'll find that out sometimes a year after they think they've stored everything, when they take a CD off the shelf and realize it's not playable. So that I think that the wave of the future is this multi-repository network that institutions should start to build from small to large, so the material is kept safe. And again, we're speaking at the very beginning of the digital age. I'm sure that years from now, every institution will have a small cube with enough server space in it to to store every book in this library. But even then, you want to be able to spread this information around. You make it more accessible simply by having it at more than one archive, even if the other archives have no plans for serving the material in any particular way. So I think that's a major idea we have to spread to other institutions about thinking of themselves as part of a network rather than as a standalone storage facility.